Welcome back. A federal judge will sentence former Trump White House National Security Advisor Michael Flynn in Washington this morning. Just hours after the special counsel under a court order released a redacted version of the FBI's memo about Flynn's January 2017 interview. In the memo, Flynn describes multiple discussions with then Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak, telling agents about a closed-door meeting with him after the 2016 election, the details of which are redacted. Flynn also described Kislyak texting him to arrange a call after the Obama administration leveled sanctions against Russia. Flynn was on vacation in the Dominican Republic at the time and said he didn't remember discussing sanctions, but that if he did, he said he would not have asked Kislyak, quote, "don't do something." However, in his statement of offense for lying to the FBI last year, Flynn admitted that he had conferred with another presidential transition official who was with other team members at Mar-a-Lago about what to communicate before speaking to Kislyak. And then he requested Russia not escalate in response to the sanctions when talking to Kislyak. And that after he reported back the substance of the call to the official at Mar-a-Lago.
So Willie, you dig into this and you find out that far from, the conspiracy theory of some very desperate people on the far right who will do anything to try to protect Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, that in fact he lied about sanctions. He lied about what he said to Kislyak. He lied about ongoing negotiations with Turkey. Yep. He lied about numerous things. And again, this man was one of the top intel officers in the United States Armed Forces.
Well, that conspiracy theory you're referring to says that Michael Flynn was somehow entrapped in these interviews, that he didn't know that you can't lie to the FBI, which, as you point out, he was the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Obviously, he knew you couldn't lie, and that's why he's now going to be sentenced perhaps to prison today, although Robert Mueller recommended no prison time for him. And on the Turkey question, the amazing thing people forget is Michael Flynn, on Election Day 2016, on Election Day, published an op-ed in The Hill on behalf of the Turkish government, on behalf of Erdogan. So he was lobbying in real time, including on Election Day, and he lied about that as well. Matt Miller, what do you think happens today during sentencing? As I said, Bob Mueller suggested and recommended no prison time because of Flynn's cooperation. Do you think General Flynn will go to jail today?
I think he's probably not likely to. The only reason I hedge a little bit is that this judge, Emmett Sullivan, is one of the most unpredictable judges, and at least certainly in the D.C. circuit. And, what we've seen over the last week, you saw Michael Flynn's attorneys raise this kind of conspiracy theory, or I should say allude to this conspiracy theory in their sentencing memo last week, where they kind of raised the idea that Flynn wasn't warned, that he needed to have an attorney present, and, that maybe he didn't know what he was getting into. And I think, the judge reacted to that a little harshly in asking for all these memos to be released publicly. And what you saw over these memos that were released, two that were released last week, one that was released last night, is that, in fact, Flynn very clearly lied to the FBI. This entire conspiracy theory that he was somehow set up, that he was trapped, that he didn't lie, but that this is what the president's version of the conspiracy is, that he didn't lie. The FBI agents in the room didn't think he lied. But then Bob Mueller later decided to charge him with that nonetheless. We've seen that conspiracy theory completely obliterated. So I think there is a scenario under which the judge maybe is a little bit angry at what Flynn and his attorneys have done and treat him a little more harshly and give him a sentence. It would be a short sentence, a couple weeks, a month. But I think the most likely outcome is probably he takes the recommendation from the prosecutor and gives him no jail time.
John Meacham, we see so many cases of constitutional norms being breached every day. We see so many examples of bad faith coming from either the President of the United States or those who work for him or who have worked for him, that sometimes it's shocking to us when we just stop and take a step back and go, oh my God, this is really happening every day. I was really struck yesterday by Carol Leonnig, who wrote this great piece for the Washington Post on Michael Flynn, who tweeted, "We reported pieces of this, and yet it is still shocking to read how Michael Flynn was willing to sell out the U.S. government and lie about his foreign clients all the way to a government job steering U.S. national security policy with Donald Trump." Trump, it's still so shocking to read, says the reporter that was writing it down. There are so many of these moments, aren't there, John, where you just stop yourself and go, my God, is this really happening in the United States of America?
And that's part of the problem with actually being able to sustain the kind of, if you will, revelatory or illuminating outrage. Everybody can be outraged, and that can be blinding in its own way. One of the tasks right now for all of us is how do you take the shock and sustain it? And part of the, insofar as there is a Trump strategy, and I may be giving him too much credit there, I think it is the sense that if you just throw everything out there all the time, all the bright objects, you kick the soccer ball at the 8-year-old game, you just change the subject, you just do everything you can to keep chaos going back to the Russian idea about how they sow this political dissension. If you create so much chaos, then the public becomes inured to some extent to the kind of shock you're talking about. But I was just thinking when you were narrating the story about Flynn, remember it was a constitutional crisis in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan's national security advisors were caught violating norms in pursuit of a policy. Which was to get hostages free in Iran. Remember, I mean, so John Poindexter and Bud McFarlane, I mean, these are all names from Thermopylae for most people, but that was very nearly a constitutional crisis. Barnacle was covering it. That's how long ago it was.
That's right.
And so one of the things that I just think is worth trying to remember is we have to, I don't want to say parcel out the outrage, but it has to be a sustained conversation, because you're exactly right. The number of norms, Churchill once said of John Foster Dulles, he's the only bull who carries his own china shop with him. Donald Trump does that, right? And he smashes the china to distract us, but he's smashing our china.
And Joe, I would suggest that, you can find it online. You can go to Google. One of the great essays of the 20th century, Daniel Patrick Moynihan's Defining Deviancy Down. And it gets to what's going on in this country today, Joe. We are immune to shock because there are multiple shocks each and every day emanating from the White House, emanating from the mouth of the President of the United States, both what he says and what he's done in the past and what he does daily. We are immune to shock now.
And Mika, how offensive that there are still people who were trying to defend Donald Trump saying, quote, everybody does it.
It's so disrespectful to the American people.
Everybody doesn't do it. Everybody hasn't done it. This is a one-off. You have a president whose campaign, whose family, whose sons did everything they could to coordinate with Russia on attacks against their political opponent. I can't think of any politician I have ever known who, if they received information from Russia or Iran or another stated enemy of the United States of America, would not immediately pick up the phone and call the FBI and say, hey, listen, we got something here you're going to want to take a look at.
So we'll be talking about this a lot more. And Matt Miller, thank you very much for coming on this morning.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube. And make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.